Hello everyone and welcome to this, a thinking on what for many years was a subject that it was felt the media didn't talk about nearly enough, and then for many years it was felt that the media could talk about nothing else. And we seem to find ourselves now, a week after a transition agreement was settled, in a new world stepping outside of the European Union, but with this fundamental question about immigration and Britain's role in terms of its openness or otherwise to people from the rest of the world, still a subject that is either unclear to many or contentious for some. And so we thought that rather than try and kind of gaze into a crystal ball about the impacts of the Brexit deal, or try and give a running scorecard of the way in which businesses are changing, that we would start the year by trying to look at the issue that was in many ways the emotional driver for so much of our Brexit politics in the last decade, and has been immigration. And I'm really grateful that for this thinking, this, if you like, open editorial meeting where we discuss how immigration is now addressed in the UK, we're joined by Anne Widdecombe. When I was a young political reporter at the FT, I spent a fair amount of time trying to chase Anne Widdecombe down the halls of the Commons. She was then the MP for Maidstone. She, as many of you will know, went on to become an MEP for the Brexit Party. So I suppose is just, and so can give us a perspective on immigration. Dorian Leatham is the interim CEO of the Migrants' Rights Network. Dorian, thank you too for joining us this evening. I think you're interim CEO because I think Fiza Qureshi, who's the acting CEO, is off on maternity leave. So we really appreciate you being here. I was just talking to Madeleine Sumption, who is the director of the Migration Observatory, and she was telling me she's just relatively recently back from maternity leave. So welcome back to the world that we're in, Madeleine. I'm not sure it's one you would have rushed back to, but this is the one we've got. So thank you all for joining us. If you've not been to a ThinkIn before, just so you know, the idea that we had was, could you host a leader conference? Could you host an editorial meeting where it wasn't just a bunch of journalists sitting around trying to think through or argue through a big contentious issue? We brought in a group of experts and we opened the room to everyone. And so if it's your first thinking, please don't hold back. Please do weigh in with your point of view in the chat. I will try and bring you into the conversation. My colleague Zav Greenwood is here. He's marshalling the conversation in the chat and will point out things to me to make sure that we bring you in person. But why don't we get stuck into it? And Anne, we're lucky to have you because heaven knows you've been stuck into this issue for a while. What do you think has happened, Anne, as a result of Brexit? Do you think the heat has gone out of the politics of immigration? Do you think something fundamental has changed?
Well, I think when people talk about immigration, they talk about it as if it's some sort of homogenous issue. And of course, it's not. You've got two principal strands in immigration. You've got your lawful immigration, which has indeed changed with Brexit, or at least the degree of control we have over it has changed since Brexit. And you've got your unlawful immigration, which can be people coming into the country undetected illegally, or it can be people abusing rather than using the asylum system. So you've got two completely different strands. Now, I think we're going to be debating both strands for a long time to come. The first is that we now do have control over any lawful immigration. We were in a position where we had to accept people who were EU citizens. They had free movement, so they could move freely into Britain. We can now control the terms and the numbers when it comes to who we are or are not going to accept. And of course, those terms and those numbers can change. And I expect a lot of the debate initially to be on the actual rules that have been set so far and the impact that that might have on various groups. But unlawful immigration, which is something completely different again, has not been affected by the fact that we've taken back control over our borders with the EU or anywhere else for that matter. So that's different.
And just, it's really helpful that we start actually with that distinction. I just wonder whether or not the change in lawful immigration, I talked about it as the politics of the last decade. The truth is actually it was in the decade before in many ways when you saw really big increases in lawful immigration from the EU that in many ways sentiment changed and the politics changed. Do you think that with the reduction of EU immigration, that something fundamental is going to change in the way in which people are frustrated or suspicious about people coming in, taking jobs, taking social and public services?
Well, I think the point about immigration from the EU was that some of it was helpful and some of it wasn't. We all remember Polish plumbers. It was extremely helpful. But even when the immigration is helpful, it still puts an enormous strain on the infrastructure. It puts strain on housing, on education, on health, on general services. So you've always got that issue there. But I expect, if I gaze into my crystal ball, that most of the conversation in the coming year will be over the terms that we've set and whether they militate against particular sectors, whether they should be adjusted. And I think there will be quite a process of adjustment and learning.
So, but Anne, I'm going to come back to that in a second, if I might.
Yeah.
In a moment, we're going to sort of try and dig into the points-based system and what the implications of it will be. I know that my colleague Zav has put up those slides you may have seen at the beginning. I know that Madeleine Sumption is going to help us sort of navigate what that means. But and just to say, Joe Adams and Lydia Morton, you've raised one of the questions we definitely want to get to, which is universities and immigration. I will come back to you in a moment about that. But Dorian, I wanted to come to you first, if I might, because I suppose we look to organisations like Migrants' Rights Network to give us a view on what you think is the culture of the UK as it approaches immigration, as it approaches asylum seekers.
I mean, first of all, just to agree with Anne, it's not a homogeneous area, okay? And secondly, there's certainly, from our point of view, what successive policies have tried to do is to criminalize immigrants. We perceive that it will not actually, in terms of the objectives as stated in the papers distributed by government, it will not actually have that positive effect. It may well slow down the numbers, but in terms of what it's going to do beyond slowing down the numbers, it's a completely different issue. And we don't think that it is a fair system. There's some elements we perceive in terms of what we know about a race issue for sure. Will it disappear in years to come? I think it's going to be very difficult because the perception, and if you went and spoke to another about Brexit and immigration, is it about people from the EU, or is it immigration on a far wider scale, i.e. as the American colleagues will call it, is it also about people of colour from not just the EU, but from different parts of the world? And I think that has to be taken into consideration. And it was interesting on some of the slides that was put up early on. I was going to quote some of the figures about, the number of people from different communities who are working in certain industries, but I'll come back to that later on in terms of the actual practical research and analysis that Migrants' Rights has undertaken, which is, we believe, will have a negative effect both for the people coming here, for employers, and for the economy.
But Dorian, just to pick up on that, because for a long time, one of the issues that if you like bedeviled the whole discussion about immigration was that the immigration debate was a proxy for a latent racism in the UK, and there were many people who really pushed back hard against that and said, no, come here to Boston and Lincolnshire. This is not about race. This is about public services and job opportunities. And I suppose what I wonder is whether or not you think that there is something post-Brexit where the argument changes again, because it's not about EU immigration, it's about immigration from the rest of the world. And so I wonder whether or not that relationship between, if you like, economic immigration and then also issues of culture and identity and, yes, race come to the fore, whether or not that changes as a result of what just happened in the last week.
I think the situation for a lot of migrants will actually deteriorate in this country. And the very sad thing about it is the number of people who actually want to come here and quite genuinely work, rather than the image or impression that's been given that they're here actually sucking down on public services, which the evidence we have and from others whose research has been far greater than ours is that it's not a true scenario. So I can't see that the objective is actually going to be, the government's objective, sorry, is actually going to be achieved, apart from really damaging a lot of people. You know, I don't think the problem will go away, personally. It's starting to slow down, to be fair.
Well, I'm interested, Dorian. One of the reasons why we set up Tortoise and we started these think-ins was I always thought when you discuss the news, you often discover you know what you think, but it reveals how little you know. And I'm embarrassed to say, when we started looking into just the basics of the points-based system, I was amazed at how little I knew. So if I might, I'm just going to invite Zav, my colleague, just to pull up that first slide, Zav, that sets out the points-based system. And Madeleine, I'm going to come to you and just, Zav, if you just want to bring it up, if you would, and then I might ask Madeleine just to help us talk it through. Zav, do you want to just explain what we've got here? Or is it difficult to speak? And there you are. Hang on, let's hear from you.
Sorry, I think I was not able to unmute myself. So yeah, this system obviously came in at the start of this year. It looks complex, but it's probably slightly simpler than it seems. So essentially, to apply to work in the UK, you need to make it 70 points. 50 of those points are mandatory requirements. And so you need the offer of a job by an approved sponsor, and organizations can apply to be a sponsor, and you hear back in about 8 weeks. You need a job which is at a required skill level, and there's also some kind of minimum skill levels. So it's normally A level or equivalent is the minimum skill level that you need. And you need to speak English at the required level. And there's a specific level of English, I think it's called B1, which you have to meet to get those initial 50 points. And then obviously you still need 20 points. Now, one of the ways to get that 20 points is to have a job offer where you are meeting a salary of £25,600 or more, or the going rate for that occupation, whichever one is higher. If you don't make that minimum salary, you can substitute different criteria in. And so you can get extra points if you have a job offer in a specific shortage occupation, which is designated by this non-departmental committee, the Migration Advisory Committee, or if you have a PhD qualification relevant to the job. There are some things kind of beyond this side which are probably worth mentioning. So there's no overall cap on the number of people who can apply through this route. There are slightly different minimum salary rules for workers in certain health or education jobs, or for people who are starting their career. And the government's actually said they retain the ability to widen the attributes that are tradable to meet the needs of the economy. So the mandatory requirements are not going to be tradable, they're mandatory, but it seems like the government's given itself some latitude to widen the way that you get up to 70 points if you don't
Thank you. Thank you. It's really helpful. I wonder, Madeleine, whether I can ask you to come in. I know that you've studied the subject, you know, or been involved in thinking about the subject in the States, here in the UK, but can you just help us through what does it actually mean in practice? Who's going to be coming and who's not, do you think, as a result of this points-based system?
I think the first thing to help understand the system, actually it's easiest, I think, to ignore the points entirely. I mean, this is a point system only in the sense that there are some points in it. But it's not a point system of the kind that they have in Australia or New Zealand or Canada. That people who look at point systems, don't consider this to be a point system. This is basically a traditional employer-driven immigration, work permit system of the kind that the UK has pretty much always had. It just happens to have some points in it. And so actually, I think it's easiest to explain how the new system works by ignoring the points entirely and saying, essentially, people will be able to come in if they have a job, and that's always been the case for non-EU citizens over the past several years. So they'll need to have a job and they'll need to earn at least 25,600 unless there's an exemption that applies to them. So you'll be able to come in a job that has a lower salary than that if the occupation is on the shortage occupation list, or if you have one of the other, if you're in a STEM occupation, have a STEM PhD, these various different occupations, exemptions give some people a lower salary threshold. But essentially, the requirement for this stream is having a job offer from a licensed, from a UK employer that is a licensed sponsor.
And Madeleine, so can I just interrupt you for a second? Mm-hmm. So what's the difference between this and the Australian system?
So the Australian, well, there are a number of differences. One of the really big ones is that the Australian system, the points tested bit of the Australian system is not employer sponsored. So people are applying based on their own characteristics. So they say, okay, I have 3 years of work experience. I speak English to this level according to a particular test. I have a degree in a STEM occupation. Whatever it is, it's about the individual, and then the individual gets approved to come because of their qualities. This system is very different because this is like the UK system has always been. This is all about the job. It's actually, apart from this one issue of having whether you have a STEM PhD or not, it is essentially an employer-driven system because it is the job that you have been offered that qualifies you for the visa. And I think that's the most. There are other differences, but I think that's the most important one.
All right, and then can I just pick up, because I said I wanted to go, if I can pick up on the student point. Can you just explain? It doesn't seem to address the students' question in here. So what are the implications for universities as a result of this?
So this piece, and when people talk about the new points-based system, it's actually really only a part of the whole system, because this, what you've shown on the slides, that's just the work piece of it. And so that's only how people come in if they are applying for work visas. Now, a lot of people obviously come in for other reasons. So you have family members, and they're basically the same system that currently applies to non-EU citizens will be rolled across to EU citizens, which includes an income requirement of more than £18,000. And then for students, they will need to apply for a student visa, much like non-EU students do currently. So they would need to be sponsored by their university or college to get the student visa. And then if they want to stay on after that, they might then apply for a work visa through the points-based system. But this piece that we've been talking about is only just one slice of that system.
Well, okay, Madeleine, I'm going to come back to you to talk a little further about it. But before I go to Lydia or to Joe, Anne Widdicombe, I just wanted to come back and ask you a question. The Brexit Party, you remember, made the case for the Australia-based system. And I do take Madeleine's point. This is not the Australia-based system, is it? It's something that is quite close to the system we had.
Indeed, Madeleine's got it absolutely right when she says that it's effectively the work permit system by a different name and with slightly different criteria, but that's effectively what it is. And of course, the work permit system was always really very successful. It was a means of controlling who came in, whether they had a job, what their qualifications were, but of course we couldn't apply it to the EU, where it was a completely different setup. So all that we've really done, and Madeleine's not far wrong, is, extend the principles, and Madeleine's not far wrong, is extend the principles of the work permit system. No, it's not like the Australian system, but I actually think we've got it right, because the issue to me isn't what are the qualities and characteristics of the person coming in. It's, does that person have a job to go to or means of sustaining themselves? Are they qualified for it? Can they speak to us in English? Now, those do not seem to me to be unreasonable qualifications, but I say again what I said at the beginning. I wouldn't at the moment defend every last jot and tittle of this prescription. And I think there will be quite a conversation about parts of it. But I think as far as principles go, it's a very, very good start.
Okay. I'm going to come back and just interrogate a couple of those things, because I think there are questions about who does it exclude, particularly on low incomes, and who does it exclude who may have skills but don't necessarily have a job. But let's come back to that in a moment. Just to say, Martin Ricks, I saw your note, and I really do want to hear your story in a moment. But let's just go on to this university point. Madeleine touched on it. I don't know, Lydia Morton, whether or not you're able to put on your camera and join us, or Joe Adams. Joe, are you there and willing to weigh in? I'm hoping to hear.
Oh, yes, it is.
Yes, hello there.
Hi, yeah, so thank you for inviting me on, James. So yes, I work for the EdTech company. We've got students in 130 countries coming to various universities. And I can't share exact numbers for privacy reasons, but we've seen significant shift away from the US and the UK, both for this year and the next 2 years, shifting primarily towards places like Australia. And the big one in the EU is the Netherlands. Netherlands is offering more and more English-speaking degrees. It's just significantly cheaper for them now. They have to pay full fees in the UK. So I guess the question is, should UK universities be concerned? They've already lost a lot of income due to COVID, and this is just not going to help anything.
And just out of interest, Joe, do you think this is, Dorian's point, that it just has signalled a change in welcome, even if it hasn't signalled a substantial change in the rules?
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, I've talked to lots of students, and they now say between Brexit and Trump, they quote, obviously that's starting to change now with the Democrats coming in power, but they just feel much less welcome in places like the UK and the US, and they'd rather go to more welcoming countries like Australia, Netherlands, Germany, who are providing.
And that's not anecdotal. And Joe, that's not anecdotal. That's something you see in the numbers.
The numbers, yeah, are shifting. Yes, in terms of the welcome thing, that's anecdotal. Obviously, that's just from interviews.
Yes. All right. So thank you. I'm just going to see if I can hear from Lydia Morton, just because she weighed in on a point similar while we're talking about universities. Lydia, are you there?
Hi.
Yes. Hello. Hi there. You're at university now?
Yeah. I'm the president of the Amnesty International group at the University of Liverpool. So obviously we are very concerned about the changes, and also I think it's quite personal to us, because I'd hazard a guess to say maybe a third of our members are international students from different countries. So I think that affects our membership. So it is something that's really important to us. So I think it's just important to kind of get an understanding on where students kind of stand in terms of the new points-based system.
It's really, I mean, it's interesting. There's a whole kind of cultural point, but there's as Millie Crouch, I think, points out in the chat, there's also this big financial point about the impacts on universities. My colleague Chris Cook did quite a big piece of work on this earlier in the year, and I suppose we should definitely come back to it. Lydia, thank you. I just want to bring in Martin Ricks too, because he's got a totally different case, at least it sounds like a very different one. Martin, hello, how are you?
Well, thanks. Yeah, so okay,
can you tell us the whole story? Yeah,
sure. So my wife is Israeli. She's not an EU national, so she has a slightly a very different experience of UK immigration to when we're discussing EU nationals. So we got married in 2015, and we got married in the UK. That is down to religious things. Can get legally married in Israel, because I'm not Jewish, so that's a separate issue. But we were always planned on moving back to the UK. I was posted overseas with the Foreign Office. So we planned to come back to the UK, and for my wife to work here, she had to get a spousal visa. Fine, okay. The figures I've got in front of me are out of date. Okay, these are 5 years old. These figures, the numbers have gone up, but I'll talk you through them anyway. The first visa for 2.5 years was £905. The second visa for 2.5 years is £1,463. That's part of what is known as the 5-year route for a spouse to move to the UK with their partner. At the end of that, which is the point we're at now, we got her indefinite leave to remain, which was £2,389. Okay. On top of all of this, we have the thing called the Nhs Surcharge. And I'm sure people have heard about this. The first time we did this, it was £200 per year. So for a 2.5-year visa, it's £500. This went up to £400 for her second 2.5-year visa. I think it's gone up again now. It's £600, maybe £800. I can't remember off the top of my head. And then on top of that, you also have to do an English test, which costs several £100s, even though my wife has flawless English. She grew up in Singapore. She did GCSEs, you know, she studied in English, but still she didn't come from the US or Australia. So she had to do this test. And then for her indefinite leave to remain, she had to do her life in the UK test. Now, I'm sure people have heard about this. I mean, it's a lowly £50 in comparison. The money doesn't really matter. What it did matter to her was how it made her feel having to do this. I've got some of the questions here. Now, I don't know how many people will be able to answer this, but when did people learn to make bronze? The answer, 4,000 years ago. Where did people of the Bronze Age bury their dead? Round barrows. What was the UK population in 1901? 40 million. Why is that part of a life in the UK test? Why was my wife spending hours of her life when she could have been spending time with her family, working on her business, learning these facts? Which, does anyone in the UK know these? Does anyone in the UK need these? Anyway, back to the point at hand. These are all the hoops that we've got to jump through before you even got to citizenship, before she's actually got a piece of paper in her hand to say, I'm allowed to stay here and the goalposts won't be moved. We're really quite lucky that we can afford this. And actually, you know, we would make sure we could afford it. But when the minimum salary required to even get your foot in the door is £18,600, I can't imagine how people on that amount, or even on the average wage in the UK, can afford to realistically put aside £10,000 to £15,000 when they also have to live. And these are people who are doing this and able to work. The Nhs Surcharge, my wife pays tax. She pays for the NHS twice. She does more for the NHS than so many of my peers do. And talking of peers, they're the ones who are saving money for a house. We're saving money to make sure my wife can stay in the country with me and our son. And
Martin, sorry, forgive me for interrupting for just 1 second. So if I understand this correctly, what you're describing here, as well as just the cost, you know, cost running, if I read it right, at, you know, £1,000 to £2,000 a year to be married to someone who does not have UK citizenship, as well as the sort of implied hostility or suspicion that comes with that. I suppose my question is, nothing has changed as a result of Brexit on this front, if I read it right. Are you saying that, do you think the ramping up of the surcharge, the ramping up of the visa costs was, if you like, a kind of irrational response to the country's problems with immigration more generally?
All the way through this, we have totally believed that this is to put people off. It's as simple as that. There is no reason why the bar has to be set at this level. Where, I mean, her indefinite leave to remain, we applied quite a long time ago. I know we've had a pandemic, but there's other costs in there where we're just like, where does this money go? This isn't paying towards making services in this country better. And look, I'm on the inside. I'm a civil servant, and I work for the Foreign Office. I've been overseas. I've seen how this stuff works. We are pretty certain that we managed to get most of the way through this because I know it from the inside and I know how the stuff works. It is made difficult on purpose to make sure people don't apply. Bearing in mind, if you get something wrong on your paperwork, it's rejected. You don't get your money back. You have to start again, and you have to start again with the money. And the point I have here is, I'm coming from this from a different angle. You're basically saying to British nationals, you can fall in love with someone from another country, but it might not be worth your time and your money. And the thing that really, really upsets me the most about this is how it's made my wife feel towards the UK. She's angry at the government because she's having to basically prove her innocence all the time, even though she's never done anything wrong. She arrived here legally, and she's married someone, and she pays her taxes, and she owns a business, and she's contributing to society. Yet she constantly feels like she's being judged by the Home Office. And is that really what we want from an immigration system? What we really want is to remember that behind every single application there's a person, and there's a person and their family and their hopes and their dreams and their desires and the fears that you have. Like, literally, I'm like, what would we do if you didn't get your indefinite leave to remain? We'd probably have to leave the country. And so all of a sudden, actually, we're saying to our civil service goodbye to someone who's worked for you for 13, 14 years, because we've made this immigration process as it is. And it's not really worked because the numbers go up. So there we go.
Well, Martin, firstly, thank you for telling us. Actually, it brings it in kind of vivid and personal detail. And it's interesting, as you were talking, how people were kind of weighing in, saying much the same as you. I saw that Siobhan made this point, don't dare make a mistake on the forms, else we'll have to reapply and pay again. It seems incredibly frustrating. I tell you, though, the one thing we've done relatively well in this conversation is actually have some clarity about what Anne said right at the top, lawful migration, and then asylum seekers. I see that, Mark and William Jeremy have their hands up. I'm going to come to you guys in a moment, if I might. But I just want to talk a little bit about asylum seekers and the country's approach to asylum seeking, because as you'll have seen, I saw that there was some commentary about the piece that Jack Schenker wrote right at the top. Unfortunately, Jack Schenker, who's spent some time down in Kent, who spent some time, looking at Napier Barracks, is here this evening. Jack, I want to just get a sense from you of what stood out for you, because, yours is a long piece that discusses, actually from many different sides, both the concern about migration, the concern about the UK response. One of the lines in it that really stood out to me was this line that you had, which was that 29 people had died in Home Office accommodation who were asylum seekers, 5 times more than had died crossing the Channel. And obviously I don't know the circumstances of those 29, but what's happening there, and what do you think's happening, Put lawful immigration aside for a second, in terms of the UK's response to asylum seekers?
Yeah, thank you, James. I mean, the figures for asylum seeker deaths in Home Office accommodation are really quite shocking. And for those that aren't aware, the government has a legal duty to house and provide support for asylum seekers who would otherwise be destitute, and to provide that accommodation, they contract a number of different housing providers, private firms. Napier Barracks, which the piece focuses on in some detail, is a Ministry of Defence site, but it's being run on a day-to-day basis actually by an Essex-based property firm that specialises in providing that kind of accommodation to asylum seekers. Unfortunately, there's often not a lot of detail on kind of injuries and deaths to people in Home Office accommodation, and those figures also include people in immigration detention centres, of which there's a network around the country, more than 20,000 at any one time, people being held indefinitely ahead of supposed deportation, although many get overturned on appeal. But we know that there are reports of really substandard accommodation. The government's had to intervene a number of times. And we've also very aware from migrant rights organisers, from medical experts, that the combination of kind of cramped conditions, of uncertainty over one's future, of a really kind of labyrinthine bureaucracy that asylum seekers at a very vulnerable time in their life have to wade through to secure their future, has a huge effect on mental health. And so that has also contributed to, some of those figures in terms of people dying in Home Office accommodation. Just very, very briefly mentioning some of the things that stand out. There has been a huge focus last year, in particular, on small boat arrivals on Kent beaches. And, we saw this huge media frenzy, migrant madness, headlines saying Priti Patel, send in the Navy. The Daily Express referred to lawless chaos. I want to just correct Anne on something she said very early on when she referred to illegal immigration. It's really important to underline that it is entirely legal for anyone to come to the UK and seek refuge, even if their claim is later denied. That's enshrined in international law. But just putting those numbers into context,
sorry, Jack,
yes.
Jack, can I just pause 1 second, because I can see I've been quietly winding, or not even that quietly, winding Louise Jarvis up the wall by referring to lawful immigration and asylum seekers. I think people appreciate that seeking asylum is lawful. What people would also say is that there is the manner of entry into the country can be illegal. So sometimes when they're saying this is illegal, that the manner of entry, that's the point they're making.
Yes, I mean, I think I'm sure somebody like Madeleine might well be able to kind of add more light on the kind of exact legal situation on this. But my understanding is that it is you are entitled to enter a country to apply for refuge as seeking haven from war or persecution, and that it is not illegal, even if you may have broken the rules of entry, but that doesn't necessarily make you an illegal asylum seeker. There is no such thing. And it's really important to note in this context that for most of the people who are applying for asylum in Britain, they have no other choice but to enter the country illegally, because the UK, despite the advice of many people across the political spectrum, has consistently refused, on the most part, to offer safe and legal passages for people to come and apply for asylum, or to create centres in places like Calais where people can go through the bureaucratic process and then come in a regular manner if their claim is approved. So people have no choice, by and large, to other than to traditionally hide on the backs of lorries, which then come on ferry or in the Eurotunnel. But in the past year, precisely because of the pandemic and the fall in traditional freight as a result, people have instead been getting into dinghies. And that's why we've seen a big rise in the number of small boat arrivals on Kent beaches. We've gone from about 300 people arriving that way in 2018 up to about 2,000 in 2019, and then last year over 8,000. But as I say, those numbers need some context. But compared to other European countries, including kind of Spain and Italy and Greece, our small boat migrant numbers remain incredibly low. But compared to the overall picture of asylum, despite the rise in small boat arrivals, actually asylum claims fell last year. In the year up to September 2020, which is the year we have full data for, asylum claims overall fell 8% on the previous year. So this notion of a migrant crisis, especially when you put Britain's asylum claims in the context of other European countries, just doesn't stack up. In 2019, for example, Germany had 142,000 asylum applications, France 120,000, Spain 115,000. The UK figure was 36,000, a third of the EU average. So the answer to the question, which is often pushed by people who are anti-migration and have made that the basis of their political platform of why do they come here, is that for the most part, people are not coming here. There is no migrant crisis when it comes to asylum.
Jack, thank you. And by the way, there's something as well written as your piece was yesterday. The thing that you did with Chris Newell, our colleague today, Fog in the Channel, the data viz, really sets that out. And it was completely fascinating to me, looking at the numbers and then being able to dig into also where people come from, because I think there's something really interesting there. So I just kind of nudge everyone in the direction of that. Jack, thank you. I want to, Dorian, I want to come back to you in one moment, but I'm just going to ask my colleague Nhs Omer, it's all I mean, Nhs, we work together at Tortoise, so that I know a little bit of this story, so I'm slightly cheating, but I'm intrigued by what you said about having second thoughts about applying for citizenship at the same time as saying how difficult it is for people to go through the process that Martin was describing. So can you tell me what your experience of it is?
Yeah, so I've been in this country since 2002, since I was like 3 or 4 years old-ish. and we moved here from the Netherlands as EU citizens. And I've just kind of been here, and then obviously Brexit happened, and then had to apply for settled status and like show my family how to do that. Some of my family still haven't applied. It really stresses me out because the deadline is right around the corner now. And it is, I just always thought that, I don't know, like the cost of getting a citizenship is so expensive. Like all you hear are the horror stories of like you make one mistake on the application and then everything goes wrong. The bureaucracy of it, everything is made like 10 times more difficult than it needs to be. There, like I know quite a few people who work on like doing visa applications and work in like immigration generally. And the way they talk about it, it just like is a nightmare to me. And all I can think about is like one technicality, like, and I'm out the country. I used to literally joke all the time for like, between the bit where settled status was announced and after Brexit had happened, I was like, I could be deported back to Amsterdam any minute. Like I literally I had that little faith in this country and like the fickle way that we treat immigrants. And I don't even know how my parents did it, to be perfectly honest, because my mum doesn't really speak very good English. And it just is crazy to me. And I don't think that, also I'm disenfranchised by this choice though. Like I can't vote as a result of like not having citizenship. And I just think that what it does is, I think it's true, it makes you constantly feel like you're not really a part of this country in any real way. It alienates you in the most profound way, and it constantly indicates that like nobody cares about you, and this immigration system is designed like by definition to keep you out. And it is, like Martin said, just they do it so that like to stop people from like doing it, to stop people from applying for citizenship, to stop people from coming here in the first place. And it is like a constant anxiety, like it causes me anxiety all the time. And so I don't know, I just think that it is, when people talk about immigration in these really abstract terms,
Yes.
about like, you know, like these conversations that we've had ad nauseum about, are immigrants good for the economy, and like, are they taking jobs, and the same things that we've been talking about for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. And it doesn't matter how much like information the ONS shows you that that's not true, or like we take the context so far out from the individual people here at the bottom, the families, the like, you know, the immigrants, you know, the refugees, whoever they are, like they're people. And I think that in this conversation we forget that.
Nimo, thank you. I feel as though there's a whole story just to tell that particular story, but I just want to go back to Dorian, as I said, and I want to see if we can just follow up on the point that Nhs McNamara raised around Dublin and asylum seekers and the changes in rules there. But Dorian, one of the questions that arises from the change as a result of Brexit and our points-based system is whether or not you're going to see more people seeking asylum because they can't approach the UK lawfully, because they can't get in for lower paid jobs and they can't get access more easily into the country. What do you think of that as a problem?
I think that issue will grow. But before I answer your question, James, and listen to what everyone's saying, there's a huge cohort of migrants in this country which are being discriminated against, which no one knows of. So there are people who've been living here for 10 or 20 years lawfully in highly skilled jobs. And because they have made a mistake on their tax returns, they're being criminalized, and they're actually, some of them, and there's been quite a few hundred, about being deported back to where they came from, even though they're skilled people, they paid their taxes, they haven't committed any criminal acts, yet the policy which has been implemented by the Home Office is to criminalize them because they fill the tax return wrong, sometimes even 10 or 12 years ago. And it's something that, you know, just another thing about saying, why am I here? So, but to come back to your question, I think in terms of asylum seekers, and I speak from experience because I worked in Croydon before, I worked in Hillingdon, and outside of Kent, Croydon and Hillingdon had the highest number of asylum seekers and refugees coming in this country. So I know some of the issues, but I do not believe that because people actually come in here from the circuit, whether it's from Syria, whether it's from wherever they're coming from, they're coming here seeking help, wanting to have a decent life. And yet the government, from my point of view, it's criminalizing them. And I don't think the numbers will go away. I don't think, and going back, I can't remember, was it Jack, I think, was talking about numbers, you know. To me, it's absolute nonsense that they're not being catered for. They are, in fact, most of them are more than capable of providing good services, helping the economy, etc. But somewhere along the line, and I don't want to say it's a race issue. I think there is a race issue involved in this, but the individual refugees and asylum seekers are being criminalized, but they have no choice. And it saddens me that this country is actually treating those people seeking assistance with, if you like, compartmentalizing them, and all the people who've talked about the impacts of mental health. And it's not just the mental health of the adults, it's the mental health of the children as well.
Of course, and the whole fact, and I was struck by what Nhs just said about the knock-on effects on different members of her family and her anxiety and stress about them. You could see that. Dorian, I tell you what I do want to know. I'm aware of time. Is that this point about the Dublin rules? I appreciate the lines in the chat that have clarified my language around illegal entrant versus illegal asylum seeker, right? I see that's really helpful. One of the things, though, that is confusing is about what are the rules that now govern asylum seekers. And if you go back, you'll see in the chat, Neve McNamara asks what seemed to me to be one of the key questions, which is what happens now as an asylum seeker into the UK? And I wonder, Madeleine Sumption, are you there? Madeleine, can you just explain what's happened now in terms of, you know, where firstly just explain what the Dublin rules, the Dublin regulations were, and how our departure from the EU does or doesn't affect that.
Sure. So this the Dublin agreement was essentially an agreement between EU countries about who processes an asylum claim. So this is generally talked about as being a mechanism for processing the claims in the first country that someone gets to. It's actually much more than that. There are basically a kind of set of principles that determine which EU country should process the claim of an asylum seeker, and so there may be cases where someone might be transferred, as in the UK case, out of the UK to have their claim processed somewhere else. But they could also be transferred into the UK, for example, if they have close family members here. So essentially, it's a kind of sorting mechanism. The impacts, it's difficult to know exactly what's going to happen going forward, because it'll depend on a whole host of things, including the kind of relationships that the UK has with other EU countries on this. Overall, the UK has not been a sort of massive net exporter, if you will, of asylum applicants. So there haven't been very large numbers of people going back to other countries to have their claims processed there. So it's, you know, in terms of overall, obviously there will be individuals who weren't greatly affected by this. For example, people who might have been able to come to the UK because of family members, but I don't think it's necessarily going to have a huge impact on the total number of asylum claimants who are processed in the UK.
Okay, that's interesting. I want to, I said I'd come to Marco, and I'm sorry if I kept you waiting for a while, Marco. I don't know whether you're still there and able to speak. I did also, Marco, are you there? Can we hear you?
I'm here.
Yes. Hello.
Yeah, I'm here. What?
Yes, sorry, you had your hand up, and I didn't know whether there was a point you wanted to make.
Yes, well, there is. I'd just like to say I greatly sympathise with Martin and with Nemo and others who are going through the application process and finally are set the way they are, because it does look like a crude device just putting people out. And that's one of the problems with it. We're not very good, I don't think, as a country, being honest about whether we want people in or not, and why, and so on. And it's just working very badly. I feel very strongly about it, not least because I've spent 25 years teaching national boarding school. Live and to be educated, that's, you know, it's in my bloodstream. So instinctively, I'm very much in favour of having free migration. But there is another angle on it. I do find it a very difficult problem to discuss with some people, because in some ways it's like one of the planks of Thatcherism. People my age and older will remember very well Norman Tebbit saying that people should get on their bike and look for work. So there is this expectation from the right wing of economics and politics that you make the world more efficient by having people move around constantly in search of where the jobs are. And according to basic economic theory, that's how you plug gaps in labour markets, you make production more efficient and resolve unemployment problems and all that kind of thing. But the reality of it is, of course, that what we've seen in recent years, particularly in Europe and with people getting into Europe, is that Labour, when it does move, contrary to what some well-intentioned books have, doesn't move, it moves in sudden tidal waves and sudden surges, which are erratic and not always helpful. And I'd like to hear Madeleine's angle on this one in a way, because she must have studied some of this from what I've read about what she's done. That what really goes on, particularly I think with illegal immigration, which you've had into some places like South Spain in quite alarming ways, is that you create more what we call monopsony power for local employers. And employers increasingly these days are not little companies or big multinationals who've got a lot of power, and the sudden big migration of labour shifts the balance of power in the labour market more to employers. And this is a worry because it creates more inequality.
I think that's really interesting, and it goes back to this point that Madeleine and Anne echoed on the work permit, effectively a work permit system. I just wanted to, as we're coming towards the end, I wanted just to make a nod to two comments that have been made in the chat, which were about something really profound. I thought that, you know, Nicky Gorb made a point about going to pick up his son's naturalization passport from the German embassy, having said that his grandfather had come over in the Kindertransport and his other grandparents had died in Auschwitz, and what a transgenerational trauma this is. I mean, many of you will know that that's a story that is very familiar to me and my family, and what an emotional impact that has. And I was also struck, I must say, by what Peter Flynn, I think it was saying about the hostility to people who'd served in the armed forces for the UK and then found themselves finding it incredibly difficult to have a life here. I'm really struck by the way in which this reverberates intensely personally for people who come from very different histories and very different parts of the world. I wanted, though, in the last few minutes, I know that Catherine Thane works with Dorian, and I wanted to hear, Catherine, what you're working on, and I was going to come back to you if I might, Anne and Madeleine. I know there are many other people who want to speak, but I'm going to try and limit it just to the three of you, just to sort of try and make sense of this as we come towards the end of our hour. Catherine.
I think difficult task, James, to make sense of this whole discussion, but a few points I wanted to raise. I work with Dorian and with different groups of migrants, particularly migrants of colour. And I do worry about the disproportionate impact of them, which I'll go into. Just to come back to what Martin said earlier as well, about the outcome of what happens when you make a mistake on your form and you can't afford to reapply, which is the case for many of those I work with. The simple answer is you do become destitute and homeless, and in touch with many people who've been forced into that position through COVID-19 in the past year. Bigger philosophical questions, which there's no time to go into, are really as well for me around the value of the person that's placed on the contribution that they make to the UK. And it kind of creates a narrative of good versus bad migrant and those who are valuable and those who are not. And then again, the disproportionate impact on Black migrants and migrants of colour that I work with, who face different barriers either in the EU or not in the EU, including those as well in the UK who need to reapply for indefinite leave to remain. Those barriers that they face because of the colour of their skin, for example, and many other identifying factors, are not taken into account. It's simply based on the level of job that you can acquire. So hopefully that's something that can be debated and looked at in the future. And the precedent, I think, the most striking precedent for me of concern is with the highly skilled migrants that I work with. It's been reduced from about 400 to 65 families who still remain in the UK, and they now have to reapply for indefinite leave to remain. These are very highly skilled people, not that that makes them more valuable than other humans, but just to put it into context, many of them have MBAs. They all have 90% plus have jobs, postgraduate degrees from the UK universities and very senior jobs. And due to new tax discrepancies, which have been found by the Home Office based on subjective good character reference determinations, which are applied differently depending on which person you ask in their application. These guys now are being asked to leave the UK. Their value is being determined as no longer valuable because they can't any longer be trusted. And I am worried that these guys, all of them are people left. So yeah, sorry, just to raise that.
And I appreciate that, and I appreciate the fact that the point that you made and that Dorian made, which is about the extent to which this hostility has a read across as certainly interpreted as racism in action, and I really appreciate you making that so clearly. And before I go to Madeleine again, I just wanted to come back to you. When you listen to this conversation, it clearly is the case that Britain has changed in its approach to immigration. Some fundamental things have changed in terms of the rules and the way in which people can approach the country. One of the questions, though, is what it says about the culture of the UK and the society we are. And I wonder what you reflect on, the way you think of it when you hear this discussion.
Let me tell you one thing that has not changed. And I was the immigration minister in the mid-90s, where the abuse of the asylum system was our single biggest worry when it came to immigration. And I do mean abuse, not use. And I'm sorry, I just cannot let pass that description we had a little while ago about how there's no such thing as an illegal asylum seeker. What actually, there's a bogus asylum seeker. What actually happens is, look at Sangatte, just look at Sangatte. You've got a large crowd of people there in a country that is perfectly safe, that is under the rule of law. France is a signatory to every last convention on refugees that we are also a signatory to. There's no distinction. And yet you have people there who, instead of applying for asylum in France, which they're entitled to do if they really got a case, they spend all their days trying to get unlawfully into Britain on the lorries. That is what they spend their days trying to do. And if anybody imagines that when they get here, they immediately say, please, I claim asylum, that frankly is a rarity. They get into the country, they disperse very quickly, they disappear. We don't have national identity cards. We do not routinely practice detention except at the very end of the process. And so we've no idea where they are. And then when they are caught, at that point, they say the three words, I claim asylum. I watched it, and it's still going on now. And Sangatte, all these years later, is still functioning in the same way.
And just can I just press you just to answer the question, which is how you interpret what our approach now to immigration says about the UK in the world and our approach to people coming from other places in the world.
I think what it says is that we have an orderly approach, that people are welcome if they fulfill the criteria. People who are genuinely seeking asylum and entitled to it are welcome, as they have always been, but that we do want to control the terms on which people come in the usual way of immigration. I see nothing wrong with that. Other countries do it. They are not accused of being unwelcoming. There's no reason why we should be.
Right, okay, and thank you. I'm going to ask Madeleine Sumption to have the last word, if you might, Madeleine, because as I think Mark noted, you studied this globally. I guess my question is, what does Britain's answer to immigration tell us about the country? What is our, if you like, culture towards immigrants?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think Britain is a country that is deeply conflicted about migration. And the last few years, actually, we've seen quite, in terms of public opinion, we've seen some really interesting shifts. So the salience of immigration actually really declined after the referendum. It was one of the biggest issues that people cited in terms of when you asked, what are the most important issues facing the country around 2015, 16. Very large shares of people, and sometimes around 50% were saying immigration. And then it really has declined since then. Since the referendum vote, attitudes do actually seem to have become more positive over the last few years. But I think in terms of the sort of government's approach to immigration, one of the things that's really challenging for policymakers is that they're trying to achieve a lot of different things with immigration. So they are aware of pressures of public opinion, the desire to put across a feeling that an impression that the immigration system is under control, which is something that is in any country is always going to be very difficult. But then they have these totally different concerns about economic growth that they're trying to promote, compliance with international laws on humanitarian migration, and all of these objectives. It is very difficult for them to satisfy all of these objectives at once.
Can I just one thing? I just messaged someone who was pointing out that actually, if you look at the polling on immigration in the UK, people of colour, i.e., people who were people of colour, polled in exactly the same way as the rest of the population on immigration, i.e., the same proportion of people being hostile to immigration. And I just wondered whether or not you point in the last 5 years, Madeleine, to a shift, a slightly less hostile position on immigration. Is that true across the whole of society? Is that pretty much evenly spread?
Well, so I don't have data in terms of by the ethnicity of the respondents, but there have been shifts across a lot of different demographic groups towards becoming, so people being more likely to say that they think that the economic or cultural impacts of migrants are more positive. It's still not, the UK has not shifted to being a country that where vast majorities of people say, we want more migration. That's certainly not the case. But attitude 5 years ago, say it was the case that that attitudes were distinctly skeptical about migration, and I would say that is no longer the case.
Right. Okay. Well, Madeleine, thank you. I've done an absolutely lousy job of keeping to time, not least because we've learned something about ourselves. Or I certainly feel I've learned something about ourselves, which is to actually answer the question, does Britain have an answer to immigration now? I can't help feeling that in listening to people who've got a depth of expertise and experience in this, the answer to that question is yes, Britain does have an answer. It clearly does have an answer that was fundamentally different from the one it had a decade ago. It's changed its relationship with the European Union, and a group of people who could have come here before can't come now. It also has an approach which I think is really made clear when you hear the stories of Martin, or you hear the stories from Catherine and Dorian, or you hear the stories from Nimo. It's clear that it's not just a system, it's not an answer just in law, it's an answer that's in the approach it takes. I think the difficulty is that it is, as Madeleine just said, it's as divisive an issue as it was before, because the answer is seen by some people as as reasonable and practical, and to many, I think I'd say the majority probably on this call, but certainly I feel this, there's such a sense of hostility and suspicion that is woven through the system, and that's not just personal, but it's practical for many people too. I do think that the fact that we managed to talk separately about different means of coming into the country is really helpful. I do think there are fundamental questions that continue to grow around responses to asylum seekers, and I do think that Jack Schenker's reporting for us pointed to some of those. But I also come away thinking that it's been incredibly helpful, given all the talk about Brexit deals in the last few months, to actually get back to one of the central issues, which is the one that I think had dominated our thinking. And I just wanted to say a big thank you to Anne Widdicombe for setting out the politics of it and her point of view. A big thank you to Dorian and Catherine from Migrants' Rights Network, and a huge thank you to Madeleine, actually alongside Zav, for helping me to understand the points-based system. Even if, Madeleine, the point is not to pay too much attention to the points at all. So on that note, can I just say a thank you to everyone for joining us. I hope that you feel as though you have a better grip on the way in which immigration works in the UK. You may like it, or possibly you may not. But thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you at a ThinkIn again soon. All the best.